This mic doesn't look like it's working anymore.
I don't think I'll need it.
Yeah, I've got another one here anyways. So next up, last before lunch is Ravi. Ravi kind of annoyed me last night because he didn't send his bio through until late last night, early this morning. And so instead I had to Google Ravi. Now, he's given me the bio, but I've decided I'm going to tell you about it. So, Ravi has a selection of used technology goods on Gumtree, which are interesting. Ravi is one of the top 21 Ravi Nayyars on LinkedIn, so congratulations.
Oh, wow.
That's exciting too. But if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot more to Ravi than just that. So he's also contributed or authored 14 different publications, which is very cool stuff. And on a very wide variety of topics, not just focused on the content that he's going to talk to us about today. He's an honors student.
That wrapped up last year.
Just last year, wrapped up last year? Okay, so that's completed. I'll let you talk about that maybe. Sure. He's got a CCI credential, which none of you probably know what that is. I'll tell you what it is, though. It's a Certified Cryptocurrency Investigator designation. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I will go through that a bit right at the end.
Okay.
Pleasure.
So, with that, come on up, Ravi, and we'll get you started.
So, the criminal economy is a force to be reckoned with, fueled by the profits of peddling drugs, weapons, child pornography, hacking tools. I can go on all day. Its backbone is money laundering. And Mark Goodman, a veteran US law enforcement agent, now an author, he said it quite beautifully, where he said that Moore's law works for criminals too. And cryptocurrencies are yet another case study of Moore's law applying to the criminal economy. So, oh, sorry, I think we've gone a bit too far. Graham, actually, can we just make this full screen? Is it like a presenter mode or something?
The answer is probably yes, but good luck with that. I've gone through there, I didn't see it earlier, so.
Sometimes Command F is
Yep. Oh, I think that should do it. Beautiful, that's fine.
Does that actually control this?
That's fine, yeah, I can go back and forth. Awesome, thanks. So after that short interruption, in the process of my speech, we will stare into the crypto laundry with a regulatory lens and look at my thesis question. My former thesis question: can conventional anti-money laundering regimes regulate cryptocurrency ecosystems? And spoiler alert, I argue that they can, and that the sky isn't falling on our heads. So let's set the scene a bit first. So money laundering essentially is the process by which criminals disguise the criminal origins of their finances. It has three distinct stages: placement, whereby the criminal will deposit their dirty money into the legitimate financial system; layering, which is the second stage, whereby the criminal will put that money through a series of transactions, often overseas, to kick up an audit trail. And finally, you have integration, whereby the criminal brings the layered money back into their home financial system or another one of their choice, basically to make them available for their use. They can integrate through various ways. One way is, of course, real estate, fast cars, diamonds, that sort of thing. So anti-money laundering law is all about mitigating the risk of that happening. And in doing so, it imbues certain institutions that act as financial hubs within our economy with certain obligations. These obligations are risk assessment, assessing the financial crime risks associated with their products, with their customers, with their business models. Next you have Know Your Customer due diligence, or KYC. And thirdly, you have transaction monitoring. And within transaction monitoring, you have an obligation to, if you're in Australia, report international funds transfers, report large cash transactions or threshold transactions under our law, and of course, suspicious matters. And there's like a list in the legislation that says, certain indicators to watch out for if a transaction is sus. So underlying all of this is the risk-based approach, which is a philosophy of regulation that whatever you do, whatever risk you're tackling, the resources you put to the job are proportionate to the size of that risk. And just a bit of a who's who, the people who are regulated for AML purposes in Australia are called reporting entities, and I'm going to use that term throughout the preso to talk about regulated entities. Internationally, we have the Financial Action Task Force, which is, you could say, the international standard setter for national anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing, or AML CTF regimes. It's an intergovernmental organisation set up in the head of Pablo Escobar by the G7 countries. It's basically a forum for AML policy development. Domestically, we have AUSTRAC, which is our AML regulator and financial intelligence unit. And AUSTRAC, given the nature of the AML regime, works directly with reporting entities and, of course, its partner agencies in intelligence and law enforcement to fight financial crime. So I'm not going to go through this slide as much given the nature of our audience that, we know the difference between fiat currency, virtual currency, and cryptocurrency. I just want to focus on these three boxes. Basically that, as we've talked about, blockchain is just one part of the DLT family. And of course, you have cryptocurrencies that are underpinned by blockchain, but of course, if you look at IOTA, it's underpinned by a Tangle, which is not a blockchain. And to make my life easier, given that there was more literature available on them, my thesis in this presentation focuses on cryptos that are underpinned by blockchain-based networks. So my analysis does not consider stuff like IOTA. Okay, so back to the research question, can conventional AML regimes regulate cryptocurrency ecosystems? So there is one camp that is quite vociferous in arguing that no, you can't. And they have three basic limbs to their argument. The first limb is that crypto users, especially in the peer-to-peer context, are pseudonymous or anonymous. Take Bitcoin and similar cryptos. So users unidentified beyond an alphanumeric string of characters. So obviously there's no name, no photograph that you can use. If you look at privacy coins like Zcash and Monero, you can hide that address. You can hide your transactions through sophisticated encryption. So in a sense, it is argued that, cryptocurrency hits the KYC pillar of conventional AML for 6, because you can't identify people. And plus, you can't effectively monitor their transactions and identify risk. The second limb of the no argument is the fact that cryptos facilitate the international transfer of value. And this, of course, stems from their dependence on blockchain technology. A decentralized global value transfer system. A system that, given that it is distributed and decentralized, cannot be externally regulated by a government saying, we know criminals, we know the North Koreans are stealing tons of Bitcoin, we want to shut this down. Well, they can't really. So when you think about it, this makes the fact that the system can be used to move money internationally, internationally, crypto can be a wonderful way to layer criminal finance. For instance, who needs the BVI when you have Zcash? That's one argument. And the US Treasury even remarked, I think it was last year, that cryptocurrencies can be regarded as more versatile than cash for cross-border value transfer. On to the third limb, jurisdictional arbitrage. This is linked to the second one. So jurisdictional arbitrage essentially means that a criminal, in this context, is able to jump from country to country to evade a certain national regulatory regime. And this is enabled by blockchain technology, the fact that operating through the internet, a very resilient system. So the criminal just needs to go wherever there's the internet, and they know that their their infrastructure, if they're relying on cryptocurrency, can't necessarily be shut down. And this leads to some interesting outcomes. The New York State Attorney General put out a report last year called the Virtual Markets Integrity Initiative Report, and they flagged the issue of underground exchanges committing jurisdictional arbitrage. The fact that, with a blockchain, they can operate essentially wherever, and also the fact that they can actively attempt to conceal their location from, say, a high-risk jurisdiction. They can refuse to identify the jurisdictions where their customers are from, such as, they don't check for whether they're from Iran or North Korea, subject to US sanctions. And as a result, they are big sources of financial crime risk. And I think if you want to look at an exchange exploiting this, just look no further than BTCE, now of course defunct. In fact, it was reported that BTCE was responsible for the washing of 95% of all ransomware payments made since the start of 2014. So that just tells you that, what an offshore exchange can do. But in response to the no argument, I have these two things in reply. So the first things first, the pseudonymity or anonymity, at least in the peer-to-peer context, is at best imperfect. Let's break it down. Firstly, with Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies with public blockchains. You have public, largely tamper-proof financial evidence that anybody can see. You don't need a search warrant to query the database. You can just log on to Wallet Explorer or Block Explorer and job done. Also, sure, you only see addresses, you don't see names. But hey, you can combine on-chain information with stuff off-chain. Like, a criminal, one way they caught the dude behind Silk Road was that he basically used his real email address in a Bitcoin forum, and the feds connected the dots to a crypto address, and they thought, okay, we can leverage this. And there are also heuristics out there that have been vetted in the literature, talking about how you can, perform address clustering. That, if you have a ton of addresses transacting at basically the same time and sending it to, say, one central party, there's a big chance that those addresses are owned by the same person. This is, of course, in the context of one transaction. And of course, this leads on to the fact that blockchain forensics is a real thing. The feds have gotten much smarter since the time they took down the Silk Road. You can actually get specialized software that automates the forensics process from companies like the Blockchain Intelligence Group, Chainalysis, and Elliptic. And so that essentially means that the KYC pillar is not entirely eroded by crypto land. The fact that, you can move to identify people and effectively monitor their transactions, which are, of course, public. Now, you may be wondering why I've put privacy coins here. And I wanted the same thing when I was doing my research. Because, by default, you have access to tools in Zcash and Monero to cloak your identity and cloak your transactions. The only thing is that a lot of users of privacy coins don't use them. In fact, a paper from, I think it was University College London researchers found that less than 15% of Zcash transactions are actually private, because users don't interact with the main anonymizing feature of Zcash, the so-called shielded pool. With Monero, now Monero is cute because it has a native mixer that you can leverage to confuse investigators. But again, that isn't used by people transacting. And sure, you may be thinking, but a criminal surely won't be that stupid. There's a chance the criminal won't be. But the way these protocols are designed is that if somebody does not use the proper encryption or what have you to protect their identity, to protect their privacy, there's a cascade effect of decreased privacy across every hop of people that original careless user is transacting with. So there's a real chance that a criminal, a self-respecting criminal, would have his or her operational secrecy blown because some Joe or Jane earlier on didn't cloak their transactions properly using what was available. So that again goes to show that, again, the KYC pillar and by extension the transaction monitoring pillar of what we call AML, they're not entirely IPv6. Moving on to the second limb of my argument, the fact that criminals love fiat currencies way, way more. They generate their criminal proceeds in fiat way, way more. Let me give you some numbers. So in 2011, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they put out what I call a landmark report, where they thought, okay, let's look at various estimates from the IMF, from national governments, and from our own people, and figure out, okay, how much criminal finance is out there waiting to be laundered? So just raw proceeds from any predicate offence, any underlying offence. So they said, based on 2009 GDP figures, we think that figure is 1.6 trillion US dollars. And obviously these figures don't consider Bitcoin because the report came out in 2011. You've got, 2009 GDP. Bitcoin was only launched in 2009. So I looked, for a bit of contrast, I looked at the market cap of all cryptos the other day on coinmarketcap.com, and the figure comes out at under 139 billion US dollars. So that just tells, you that, criminals prefer fiat currencies in general over crypto. But then again, why am I giving you those numbers? Because law enforcement has observed over years that if a criminal is generating their proceeds, say, in cash, they are more likely to use cash to launder that money. They won't go to the effort, unless they absolutely have to use cryptocurrencies to launder their money. And let me give you another stat. That same UN report estimated that we seized 0.2% of all criminal finance worldwide in 2011. So that just tells you how effective existing ways to launder money are. Why would a criminal use crypto when you can use cash? You can use, no offense to the lawyers in this room, lawyers, accountants, remitters, international trade, existing channels, right? So that underlines the fact that the financial crime risk, the quantum of risk stemming from crypto is overstated by the camp that says no, conventional AML is IPv6. And also, the fact that criminals don't use fiat that much relative to crypto, it also suggests an interesting inference. The fact that they will start out in fiat, and if they want to get into crypto, they have to go through a gatekeeper, an exchange, or an exchanger. They can go through a legit exchange and they can go through an institution, rather, or they can go through somebody sitting on localbitcoins.org or on the dark web. Either way, it's a centralized party that is already regulated by AML law here, the EU, US, Japan, a couple of other countries. That is a reporting entity. It is required to assess risks of customers, identify them, monitor their transactions. So that makes the criminal quite vulnerable to detection. Also, sure, you may be thinking, but Ravi, you have people like BTCE or people on the dark web who just don't care. Well, that's fine. There are people you can serve with a search warrant. People you can make cooperating witnesses to flip on the criminal who's trying to use them to launder their money. So then again, the criminal has to go through a choke point, a centralized entity that can be either regulated or subjected to the processes of the criminal law. So these factors come together. Oh, sorry, just before that, I just want to add another insight from the Homeland Security Investigations Division of US DHS. They found that, based on their own successes last year, that criminals using crypto are most vulnerable to detection at the placement phase when they are going through these choke points. So then again, increase risk versus the benefit for a criminal when using crypto. Okay, so I'm not sure if y'all can read this, but I've shown you this diagram not to confuse you with dotted lines, but to show you how my thesis fits within the literature. So, yes?
So, what about using transfer level protection for criminals for things like Tor and stuff like that? Do you think that adds difference to that?
Yes, absolutely.
But as far as you're saying that they wouldn't necessarily use this because there's too many possibilities for getting caught. Is that more or less what you're saying?
I'm saying there's a great chance that they will think that. where I can use traditional ways to launder money, a cash-intensive business. I can go through lawyers who are not regulated in Australia for AML. But on your point about Tor, that's totally legit. It's totally legit. And of course, with crypto, it's sure you can identify the IP addresses of counterparties to a transaction, but of course you can cloak that through Tor or VPN. But law enforcement, especially the Americans, have been quite successful at running undercover ops on the dark web, and I think they had a big success last year where they nabbed 190, I think, drug dealers, child pornographers, that sort of thing, by simply going through the launderers they were using on the dark web. They basically caught a launderer, they flipped him, and they said, okay, let us use you to get intelligence, and they basically exposed a massive network. So you're totally right. The criminals will always fight back. That's why you have the quote at the very start of the presentation. But it's about the fact that law enforcement is getting incredibly smart, and especially, the Silk Road. I don't know how many of you have seen the Catherine Horn TED talk about how they got the Silk Road guy, but that the process of box 1, box 2, box 3, that does not happen anymore. It's far more sophisticated. Yes.
Did you just say the lawyer on AML is not regulated in Australia?
Well, solicitors are required to report, to my knowledge, large cash transactions under the Financial Transactions Reporting Act 1988, but they're not full-blown reporting entities like banks.
So what you're saying is the lawyer can make huge amount of transactions overseas?
Yes.
Oh, okay. What I recently experienced is that it is nothing to do with lawyer.
Sure.
I recently had a lawsuit with my bank because when I sent out, I actually fall victim in a scam, and I sent out $49,000 in one transaction. No one actually report. So when I talked to a lawyer, no one seemed to know about this area. So it becomes
Was that a cash transaction or electronic?
international transaction from Australia to Singapore.
So there was no cash.
No cash.
So the only thing is that the bank handling the transaction will be required to tell Austrac that that's an international funds transfer instruction, but the lawyer is not required to report, to my knowledge.
No, I mean the lawyer seemed to be not knowledgeable about this area, and also
Those are the people who are often used by criminals.
sorry.
Those are the people who are
Oh,
often
the lawyer.
used.
Oh,
Yes.
brilliant. Yeah.
Just with accountants, trust and company service providers. Yes.
No wonder. Yeah, there was actually a Singapore lawyer. He said that he can make
That's a
huge
big
amount.
hub of
No
criminal
wonder.
finance.
And also one more question is that I heard some people after
Yes.
this experience, they say that actually when I sent out $49,000, the bank should have called me to hear what are you dealing with criminal? Does it make economic sense? Is it correct? And they failed to do it.
See, that's the thing. This sort of issue was exposed by the CBA's penalty. The fact that reporting entities historically in Australia, given Austrac's previous approach to regulation, that they have been a bit lax about, querying what's going on.
Okay.
Obviously, given the amount of money you were sending to a jurisdiction that is known for being a hub for criminal finance, I'm surprised they didn't ask you, but yeah, they're meant to. Obviously, they have a threshold of things to necessitate a report.
Yep.
But
And
yeah.
now I'm showing that why did they not fact me? Why do they not remind me it is likely to be a crime? And also talk about extract. You know what? When I report this crime to them, this issue, why do my bank not fact to me? Why do they not report to you? They say that okay, sounds like there is some problem. We will look into your particular case. However,
Yes.
we are under current regulation. We are not, Austria are not allowed to inform you the final outcome. We are not allowed to inform the court on the final outcome. We are also not allowed to inform the banking regulator. So now the regulator who is responsible to determine whether the bank have budget are not allowed us to speak, and now the other regulator who is able to determine the compensation to me are not allowed to get the results.
If I can stop you right there, what your issue is with the secrecy in the process. Now, with AML, there is a ton of secrecy. There is a provision, there is actually a criminal offence created by the AML CTF Act of tipping off, whereby if your bank suspects that you are associated with money laundering, terrorism financing, or other range of offences, they can only tell Austrac that you are sus. anybody else.
That's
Otherwise,
all right. That's
they're
all right.
creating. Otherwise, they're committing a criminal offence.
Yeah, that's all
I
right.
think that's why there would have been an
But
issue.
now the problem is that even Austria cannot tell me cannot tell the regulator, cannot tell the tribunal whether my bank have actually found the anti-money laundering law or not.
I tell you what, why don't you grab it for
The
lunch break?
Austria,
Seriously,
the
grab it for lunch break.
Austria or what?
Man, I'm so sorry. I've got hungry people here. Why don't you grab me for lunch break? I'm sure you have a legitimate grievance, so let me get back to you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you. Jonathan, did you have a question?
I was just going to explain our international standards in regards to the question. Internationally, the regulators work with KYC, and that's different in every jurisdiction. We're working towards certain minimum standards.
Yep.
Australia had certain points raised around how our jurisdiction works. These are being engaged with before and obviously close track. Some of these things would be more strictly engaged going forward.
We've got a Kahoot coming up at lunch, and you need to form teams of 2 or 3. So maybe you three.
Oh, no,
team.
no teams for the Kahoot.
Oh, no teams for the
Every
Kahoot.
man for himself, and every woman. The teams are for the other event tomorrow morning. So it's all
Okay.
good.
Sorry, Ravi. Continue on, please.
That's all right. Thank you. So, I've brought up this diagram to show you how my thesis fits within the regulatory literature. So, of course, we've all heard about centralized exchanges. Type A is what I call crypto to fiat. Type B is crypto to crypto. These people are regulated to varying degrees in Australia, the US, the EU. And we've also heard about custodian wallet providers who are regulated in the EU, and I think they are as well in the US. But my thesis, of course, talks about them and agrees with the underlying policy rationale for that regulation. But I want to talk to you about the other entities my thesis talks about, the people circled in black, the people who haven't received as much attention from a regulatory point of view, from the law, from policymakers, that sort of thing. So we're going to go through each of them. Certain categories of participants in decentralized exchanges, or DEXs, the manufacturers of so-called hardware wallets, and the operators of cryptocurrency mining pools. So let's get into that. This is the part of the presentation that talks about, okay, we've found that AML regimes are not entirely hit for 6, so how can they apply? Okay, so firstly, decentralized exchanges, or DEXs. So DEXs are interesting because, as the name suggests, there is no centralized operator who can be regulated as a reporting entity. You've just got a smart contract that's running on, say, Ethereum, or running on its own native protocol that does the custody, that does the facilitation of the trade. So who do you regulate? Well, remember what I said about AML regulation being about targeting financial hubs. So often, not often, at times, the DEX protocol will help you by creating financial hubs. Let me give you an example. Who here has heard of the DEX called 0x? Awesome. So, 0x is a protocol that creates a role for a type of entity called a relayer. What is a relayer? A relayer is essentially an entity that functions as a bulletin board in the network for facilitating, for bringing counterparties together to do a trade. So I'm thinking, let's not make relayers, full-blown reporting entities, but let's at least mandate that if you're a relayer in the DEX, in the 0x ecosystem, you are required to perform KYC on the people who interact with you, people whose transactions you facilitate. Stevie talked about this with trusted digital identity, and that is absolutely crucial for AML, especially in the DEX context. So that's one way you can do it, going after financial hubs that the protocol itself creates. Another way to do it is by going after the developers. Again, don't make them full-blown reporting entities because they're not financial institutions. What you do is you mandate that thou shalt not create a DEX unless you provide a way to onboard your customers, the people who link their wallets with your DEX to trade, unless you basically perform KYC on them using trusted digital identity solutions. Unless you've put in a control that monitors everybody's transactions to screen for suspicious matters. And a great case study for how developers can do this, for especially trusted digital identity, is the AirSwap DEX for over-the-counter trades. What they are doing, they actually rolled this out, I think in the middle of last year. they use a KYC solution that is built on the Ethereum blockchain to onboard securely all of their over-the-counter traders before they're allowed to trade. And we will talk a bit about this at the end, but this is, of course, where RegTech businesses really have a role to play in developing the controls that provide compliance for DEXs. Okay, so now let's talk about hardware wallet manufacturers. So, a cryptocurrency wallet is a device or a service that stores the underlying cryptographic private keys for your addresses. A hardware wallet is a physical device that does that. Some models look like a USB stick with a screen and a couple of buttons. So I think they're quite analogous to what we see as gift cards or what the industry calls, the AML industry calls open loop stored value cards. An example of an open loop stored value card is the MasterCard Cash Passport. They're called open loop because having loaded value onto them, you can use these cards internationally, often internationally because the underlying payment network is global. You can redeem the value stored on them in cash offshore. You can use them, at a variety of outlets and merchants all over the world. And open loop stored value cards have especially been identified for years as posing high money laundering risk. A great case study is, I live near King's Cross, so I'll use myself as an example. I make a ton of money from a cocaine deal. So what I do is I have a lot of cash. I buy a ton of stored value cards. I load them up with value, value from the deal, and I mail them. I smuggle them through the mail to my accomplice who is, say, in Latin America. And given, let's say I pick the right open loop stored value card, my accomplice can redeem the value stored on that card in cash in Latin America. So the reason I think hardware wallets are similar to open loop stored value cards is because with a hardware wallet, you can of course hand over the value stored on the device substantively to your counterparty by handing over the device. You can basically perform international transactions underpinned by, of course, cryptocurrency's blockchain technology by plugging the device into your computer and away you go. And also note that the issuance of stored value cards in Australia, obviously above certain monetary thresholds, I believe it's $1,000 if you can redeem the value in cash, $5,000 if you can't. That issuance is regulated in Australia under AML law. So those issuers are reporting entities. So hardware wallet manufacturers aren't regulated for AML purposes. So I say, why don't we regulate them in a similar way to those issuers? So I came up with a new service that is regulated, selling a hardware wallet to a person. And for KYC purposes, the customer of this service is the person who buys the device from, say, KeepKey or Trezor. And with the help of the champion that is Stevie Giassi, I came up with this definition of a hardware wallet that can be plugged into Section 5 of our AML laws. Basically, again, the clincher, all it is, it's storing cryptographic keys. And I put paragraph C in to ensure that it complies with existing law that already excludes what would be a hardware wallet from the definition of a stored value card. So how would we regulate manufacturers? What obligations are we talking about? Well, of course, AML risk assessment, a compliance program, that sort of thing. Knowing their customers, who roll up to them to buy a hardware wallet. If the customer pays with fiat, I recommend that you log any international funds transfers, that you log any suspicious transactions, but of course don't make them report large cash transactions because often they don't take cash. And the reason I say we go after hardware wallets, apart from the analogy between a stored value card and a hardware wallet, is because these people are likely to become financial hubs within cryptocurrency ecosystems. Because a criminal who won't trust a custodian wallet provider that is regulated already in the EU, because they feel that person can be nabbed, or not nabbed, it is regulated, required to talk to law enforcement, they will buy a hardware wallet because it's a surefire way to safely store your crypto basically on your person. And this is in conjunction with the credible possibility forecast by the European Commission chance that criminals will only transact in crypto. So they won't, in the distant future, they won't deal with cash at all. So this is like a future-proofing form of regulation. Okay, on to the final.
Can I just comment on?
Yeah.
I mean, you're saying that a criminal would give a hardware wallet
Yes.
to a counterpart.
Yes.
Okay, now these hardware wallets have a seed from which all keys are generated.
Yes.
So a counterparty would be very foolish to actually accept that form of payment because the criminal can still have that seed loaded up in a different hardware wallet and be able to spend those funds. Even though they transferred the hardware.
Absolutely, yeah, that's true. That's why it's like one of the criminal typologies that I look at in terms of the potential use of a hardware wallet. The main reason I talked about the criminal handing over the device was because, of course, you know, the criminal can just tell their counterparty the recovery phrase for the device, so that when the counterparty wants to wants to get access to the funds, they simply reset the device to the original party's configuration using the recovery key, and Bob's your uncle, they have access to the underlying private keys. I know it's Stevie gave me a very good example when I was researching this, that, you know, why wouldn't they just use a software wallet, for instance? But I think this is definitely a legit way to do things. Of course, you are correct in what you said. So let's now talk about mining pool operators. So who here understands what a mining pool is? I just want to go through. Okay, cool. So a mining pool, just for those who don't know, is just a way to increase your chances of successfully verifying blocks of transactions and earning the block rewards and transaction fees. Mining pools have, if you look at Bitcoin, for instance, they're quite dominant. I think only 4 mining pools control the hash rate for the network. And yeah, they are becoming, if not already, financial hubs within, if you look at Bitcoin, the Bitcoin ecosystem. Because not only are they earning tons of crypto, they're also big sources of transfers within the Bitcoin community. And the reason I put this quote up is the fact that there's a real risk that criminals will join a mining pool, for instance, using, say, a false identity to basically earn Bitcoin that they can use as the instruments of crime. In this case, the Russians, as alleged by Robert Mueller, used mined Bitcoin to partly fund their infrastructure for hacking the DNC.
So, just a quick question.
Yes.
Can you buy a mining pool operator?
Can you what, sorry?
Can you buy a mining, is a mining pool operator a business or entity that one can purchase, take over, acquire?
I believe you can. Most of them are, I think most of them are incorporated entities.
Okay, good.
Yep. Yeah, and we will go into that, into how you regulate them. So, financial hubs, real risk that a criminal can just simply join one, mine Bitcoin as a result, and use it to fund criminal activity. So, again, with Stevie's help, I came up with a couple of definitions relevant to mining and mining pools. I can talk about this in the lunch break, but what I want you to focus on is the stuff in red. The fact that when I call for the regulation of mining pool operators, I only want the law to attach to mining that generates block rewards. Because AML law is not about regulating people doing stuff for the sake of it. It's about regulating people moving value around. And that's what this definition of mining respects. And thus here we have, create a new designated service because mining pool operators are not regulated for AML purposes. So you basically have to create a new service that they are doing, operating a virtual currency mining pool of which a person is a member. For customer due diligence purposes, the member is the customer. And of course, again, the link between earning a block reward and mining that is regulated. So how would we regulate mining pool operators? So obviously, people who are familiar with them know that 3 of the largest ones for Bitcoin are in China, and I think the 4th one is in the Czech Republic. So Australia passing a law making a mining pool operator a reporting entity would not really achieve much. So that's why I say that, my recommendations, they assume that countries eventually harmonise their AML regimes, that they coordinate their efforts to identify financial hubs and regulate them. And indeed, this harmonization, this coordination is mandated by the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. They have, like, I think, a whole section on what countries should do to work together to fight financial crime. Okay, so that's the types of entities that I think the literature largely ignores, and thus how we regulate them. So I want to now talk about how this regime is to be enforced. So obviously, cooperation between governments and businesses is not the whole story. You have, cooperation between government agencies and between governments. But I want to especially talk about public-private cooperation, because the unique thing about AML is the fact that your reporting entity, whether they're crypto or not, whether it's a bank, will see huge haystacks of transactions every single second. Within those haystacks are the needles, the laundering, the criminal activity. They will see criminal typologies first. They will see threats first. They will see the problem actors first, before the regulator, before the police. So an effective AML regime rests on strong cooperation between your reporting entity and your regulator to work together to identify key sources of risk, develop controls, and evaluate the effectiveness of those controls. So that leads us to the first limb of what this cooperation should look like: financial intelligence sharing partnerships. These do come in various shapes and forms. There are a couple around the world. In the UK, there's the Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force. In the United States, there's the framework under Section 314A of the USA Patriot Act. And in Australia, there is something called the FinTel Alliance, and I want to focus on the FinTel Alliance. The alliance doesn't have any exchanges, crypto exchanges as a part of it, but it's got AUSTRAC, it's got AFP, State Police, the Criminal Intelligence Commission, and of course the largest banks, remitters, and I think it still has PayPal. What this alliance does so amazingly is that, apart from, of course, banging their heads together to develop, new tech to fight financial crime, they literally sit down in the same room, police, bank, AUSTRAC, whatever, to develop actionable real-time intelligence that can be disseminated to law enforcement agencies to help bust a massive shipment of meth or stop the next attack. The fact that, again, you pull your data sources together, you work together to identify what is a real risk, and thus you develop a way to tackle it. So that's why I think FIS partnerships are a great way to do this. And finally, there's RegTech. The fact that, reporting entities, especially the broader cryptocurrency sector, must work with the government to make compliance more efficient. A common bugbear we hear among AML practitioners is how much compliance costs. Thomson Reuters did a survey last year of a bunch of multinationals, and they reported that they spent $1.28 trillion spending. So they spent that much on fighting financial crime. So RegTech is a big part of making that process more efficient. Of course, trusted digital identity, we've talked about that today. The fact that, you don't need 3 banks to perform KYC their own 3 different ways on the same person, when you can have, say, just a non-fungible token sitting on the Ethereum blockchain that says this person's vetted, this person's low risk, don't worry about them as much. There's the RegTech businesses to develop future AI algorithms to help identify suspicious transactions. They're going to be crucial as well to the fight against financial crime, because as we use less and less cash, as we go more and more digital, we are essentially, the transactions are natively digital. So you have tons of data, big data sets of transaction information that I don't think any human can crunch on their own. And one final thing I want to talk about with regards to RegTech is, of course, education. The fact that cryptocurrency businesses, blockchain forensics businesses are the people who know the most about how these things work. And they especially have to work with government to educate government about how this works. What are the key risks? How can this particular technology be abused for criminal purposes? And this is where I want to talk about the cryptocurrency, the Certified Cryptocurrency Investigator Credential. So one of my contacts in the US is a lady who is the director of the Blockchain they're a major blockchain forensics company that do work with law enforcement both in the US and around the world, and they of course work with regulated exchanges. And they are the first to develop a credential that law enforcement officers, that compliance people can earn to, basically gain an understanding of cryptocurrency, to get an understanding of the AML regulation, and to get an understanding of, the sources of risk and how to fight them. And it would be great if, regulators, if members of regulators, members of compliance teams go through to earn the CCI credential, because it essentially, they're put through a coherent, well-paced process about what the sources of risk are, how does this all work, and how to control those sources of risk. And if you guys and gals want to learn more about it, just grab me at the lunch break. So we've gone through, whether we can regulate the cryptocurrency ecosystem using what we have in terms of law. We've gone through what that law should look like, and we've gone through how that law should be enforced. So thank you so much for listening. Ask me anything.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Yep. Jonathan.
Question for more of a societal one.
Yeah.
One of the earlier speakers was talking about the idea that you need a really big stick, something to create an emotional phase shift, to scare people into doing something.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, multiple people have mentioned the idea of a KYC token and the idea that you can have a centralized token. And the issue with this is that the liability regime for KYC is very onerous. It's deliberately very onerous
Yeah.
for every single person.
Yes.
So you catch each person in case one stuffs up. So if you had a centralized token, how would that liability regime work under your anticipated thinking? Because you effectively would give them a free pass from liability, which is what drives them to actually do something in space, which is why they work together.
So could you say that again? Like, did you say a centralized
In
token?
terms of having a KYC token of any sort, which people could rely on, because they keep checking why hashing is already on the system,
Yeah.
that would mean that they wouldn't have to go through the full process of identification themselves.
Yes.
The full process is where the benefits are obtained in some people's view.
Yes.
So if there was some sort of centralized system, putting aside political issues, wouldn't you be therefore losing the benefit that causes them to want to work together, that causes them to actually do this properly, because there isn't a big enough stick to scare them to actually do it again and again?
The fact that, they can just push all the risk over to the person who bets
Yes.
to get the token.
You get the customer service stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think, again, if we go back to RegTech, the people who develop the token, who develop the processes for vetting customers before they can earn the token, they're going to be absolutely crucial. Perhaps the banks could develop their own token that they all work together on as a consortium, or perhaps they could work with the RegTechs like Bron ID and Hopska to develop that token. I believe Barclays Bank a few years ago successfully trialled a decentralized KYC register. You are correct that they're just shuttling all the risk away to the people who are doing the initial vetting. But I guess perhaps it's the fact that if you're in Australia at least, the fact that Austrac is taking an increasingly aggressive approach to enforcement, that the banks would think twice before trying to adopt a lax attitude that we'll just rely on the startup to vet our customers and say, oh, we're innovative, we're going to use that startup rather than doing things our way.
I don't think you necessarily you still have a centralized party giving verification. It's more about having reportability and because we own that verification.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you can still move across again different services.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you own, if something goes wrong, it's where ANZ stuff.
Yeah, that's fine. So that doesn't change anything. And so ANZ might go from like KYC and it'll be a smart contract that they've signed a transaction. They can have
whatever the identity proof is that you've just done.
This is also the reason it hasn't come out, because the banks have fault.
Well, some of the banks have already adopted open banking.
Yes, but not to the reason.
No, that's right. No, that's right. Yeah.
And of course, like about what Stevie talked about, the fact that you go from institution to institution as a customer. Like, there's nothing to say that you can't design a token that if the bank, if the ANZ verified customer, let's say, goes to Westpac and starts doing suspicious stuff, there's nothing to say that the system doesn't allow Westpac to put out a message to the network that says, generate a new token with this modified policy that this person is higher risk because of XYZ quality plus the underlying token. You can just issue a new one and just say to the network the old one is invalid. This is the more updated one. Yes?
I agree with your assessment of governments need to harmonise back to your conclusion, but if I may play devil's advocate,
Yep.
you said you looked at AML, Financial Crimes Act, and how, can I just ask, and when you propose something about, regulating hardware and indexes, as part of this, did you also look at Cybercrimes Act and to really play the devil's advocate? What is it in that kind of regulation that doesn't already account for it? Why do we create more regulations for a specific AML KYC when the underlying blueprint actually might not look like a AML KYC verification problem, for example? It might actually look more like a cyber security problem.
Yeah.
So did you take that into account in your
I did. See, my thesis was not a law. It was not a Sydney Law School thesis. It was a University of Sydney Business School thesis. It was in business law, and the thing I had to be very careful about was I didn't want this to turn into a policing or a national security-based thesis. If it was that, I would have happily talked a lot more about the anti-cybercrime legislation and about tactics used by cybercrime units within, say, the New South Wales Police. Now, you make a valid point that I'm assuming the cybercrime legislation, you would know more about this than me, would cover the fact that you don't build something that can be used to facilitate criminal activity, and I respect that. But that's why I restrict my policy recommendations to AML type stuff, because I feel that we need cybercrime legislation, but I think that that's more directed at cybercrime, hacking, rather than or identity fraud, or whatever. It's not specifically directed at knowing your customer, monitoring their transactions, financial stuff, and like even with mining pool operators, like I think that they should be required to vet their customers, using trusted digital identity to identify where their customers are located, that sort of thing. I don't think that sort of stuff would be covered by the cybercrime provisions of the criminal code. But you were going to say something?
Yeah, I just want to rethink it a little bit, and it's just more food for the audience as well.
Yeah.
Because like a heart surgeon will see problems from a heart surgeon will see it as a heart surgery problem, and
Yes.
a dentist will see it as a bacterial infection problem. But we've got to actually step back and assess the whole patient.
Yes.
And the thing is, just focusing on AML and financial crimes may be a little optimal because it's a different technological arms at the moment, and if you're trying to jump, for example, to increase old example everyone knows,
Yeah.
you can bypass telephone towers by just using that's what Skype is.
Or use a satellite phone.
Sure,
Or you can use a satellite phone if you don't want to use it.
right. So my point is, there's a technological arms race.
Absolutely.
You bypass,
Yeah.
your framing of it.
Yes.
And to your point of moving to the direction of self-sovereign, that's actually a hardware and cybersecurity problem because it's very easy to create algorithms now and viruses that make everyone a criminal extension, because of the distributed nature. So, that also crosses into cyber criminal.
Sorry, could you just clarify what you said? The potential to make anyone a criminal? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Absolutely. So if I am recently on my own personal distributed wallet, for example,
Yes.
or hardware,
Yes.
unknowingly was actually facilitating cybercrime. So that's in the Grace case. There's cybersecurity research.
If I could just respond to that, I think yes. Like if you say, there was an information security podcast I listened to, Risky Business, it's great by the way, check it out. And one of the hosts said that, you know, if you're a miner of Bitcoin, you're potentially facilitating North Korean-based theft of Bitcoin. Now, the money laundering prohibition within our Criminal Code Act 995 is quite broad, that you can, you know, even if you were negligent, whether that, you know, you were handling the proceeds of crime or facilitating that, you know, the accessorial liability, yes. There is an argument, there's always an argument that you would be caught. But I think that's where prosecutorial discretion comes into play. That governments, especially in Australia, that quite frankly don't have the resources to go after every Bitcoin miner located in Australia because there's apparently a link, however small or large it is, between a miner and North Korean laundering activity. So I guess that's the thing. Look, you're totally right. The law is the law, but it's a matter of, again, how it's enforced and the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. It's basically first principles when you talk about criminal law.
Is it a comment or question over here?
I just wonder, this actually goes to the major problem that AUSTRAC have, which is managing so many false positives.
Absolutely. Defensive reporting, suspicious
So how do your thesis sort of address it?
Can I just jump in for 1 second? Great conversation. Let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
Let's eat while we're talking.
Yeah.
Go get some food, guys. Come back here. We're going to start again probably at 2:45.